Okay, everyone, I really appreciate you joining today. Welcome to today's webinar, Roses Reimagined, Sustainable Rose Garden Design and Maintenance for Arid Gardens with Maria Thomas, Curator of Plants at the Albuquerque Biopark. I appreciate you all joining on time. Maria has a lot of information to communicate with you today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with some of the webinar and rebate housekeeping information so we can then move on to Maria's section relatively quickly. So with that, I will go over the housekeeping and talk a little bit about the Water Authority's drought indices. So with regards to the webinars today, and in general, our webinars, cameras and mics will be disabled during the duration of today's presentation. If you're having issues with your speakers, those can usually be fixed here on the speaker adjustments. The meeting chat mics and cameras will also be disabled for this webinar. And given the amount of information that Maria is hoping to cover today, it's unlikely we'll have time for a Q&A portion. However, if you have quick and easy questions, you can type them into the Q&A and one of us will try to respond to them. However, a lot of questions are more in-depth and we just simply can't cover them while we're trying to administer today's webinar, but we have a great way of getting you an answer. If you send us an email to our Ask an Expert email address, one of our experts will provide an answer within a couple of days, and we will provide that email address on the slide here coming up, as well as in a follow-up email. So, as I mentioned, Maria has a lot of information she's going to cover today, and in the case that the presentation just happens to go a little bit beyond 1 o'clock, we encourage you to stay to learn everything you can from this expert. But if you need to leave at 1 o'clock, we understand. And if you qualify for the rebate, you will still receive the rebate if you have to leave at 1 o'clock and the presentation is still going. So just to summarize, if you can stay and we are going over, please do. But if you need to leave, we understand and respect that, and you will still receive the rebate if you are one of the folks that qualify. In terms of the rebate, if you are a qualifying customer, it can take 2 to 3 billing cycles, so it takes a little bit of time. It will appear under this total adjustments row in your bill. And if you have questions, you can always email us at the Ask an Expert email or at our rebate hotline, and I will display that information at several points during today's presentation. Now, I'm going to move into discussing the drought. It is bad, and there are different agencies and folks that are monitoring the drought, and we incorporate a number of those experts into the Water Authority's drought plan. And so we look at the Drought Severity Coverage Index, or the DSCI, that you can see on the map, and we are in a bad state here in New Mexico and Bernalillo County in particular. We are in the extreme drought stage, and our Drought Severity Coverage Index currently is at 400. And we also look at the Water Authority and our total gallons per capita per day. This is the unit of measurement that we are looking at our community's water usage. This is all of the water usage throughout our service area divided by the population. We have a current goal that we are striving for in 2037 and every year leading up to that. We are currently under that goal, but if we were to go over that goal, that would trigger additional actions in terms of our drought plan. We also look at our groundwater pumping with regards to our goal for the year. Currently, it is a really bad drought. It's extremely dry. The river's never dried up this early before. However, our community's water usage is doing quite well, and we are currently in what we refer to as a Water Authority drought advisory. And what that does is triggers several notable measures. One is we expand our public outreach and advertising expenditures. We customize our promotional materials to help raise awareness about the drought. And as you all are taking advantage of today, we host a series of educational drought-focused webinars where our qualifying customers can receive a $20 rebate. We are also really trying to take advantage of the increased momentum, urgency, and our other partner messaging about the current drought in order to help increase awareness about the Water Authority's operations, in order to help foster a deeper understanding by a customer's where their water comes from and what the water authority is doing to help ensure a sustainable water supply and help communicate the importance of water conservation and using water efficiently. Now, most customers, and I'm assuming many of you do understand the Water Authority's operational processes in terms of using San Juan Chama project water when it's available, as opposed to pumping from our aquifer or our savings account, as we like to call it, which unfortunately we're forced to rely on in terms of drought and low or no flows in the Rio Grande. However, we are very lucky as a community to have this redundant or dual water system. Both the aquifer as our savings account, which has been increasing in size and volume over recent history, and the San Juan Chama project water that we're able to take advantage of in years of good snowpack. We also are the only utility in the entire nation that has a 100-year long-term water planning plan and document. So this is called Water 2120. This is available on our website. There's a nice little video that summarizes it on our YouTube channel. And this means that doesn't mean that after 100 years we're out of water. It means that after 100 years we have and continue to have a sustainable water supply for our great-great-grandkids. And Albuquerque can be a vibrant and thriving community. And the way that we get there is through a number of long-term planning operations and other water supply planning that has to do with aquifer storage and recovery, forest restoration and thinning in our watersheds in southern Colorado, just to mention a few, and water conservation. It's really important that everyone conserves their outdoor water use. A little known fact, all of the indoor water use in Albuquerque is recycled and reused in one way or another. All of the outdoor water use, which is over 40% of our entire water use is used outdoors, is only used once. So it becomes particularly important to try to conserve and use water efficiently outdoors and have a healthy, thriving yard that shades the ground and provides support for our wild neighbors. And we have a number of resources to help folks with this. We have our popular xeriscaping guide. This PDF can be downloaded, or we have hard copies available at local plant nurseries. It's mostly about plants, and it has a master plant list in the back with details on over 600 plants. If you haven't already been to it, our 505outside.com is our landscape and rebate website. It's a Water Authority website, but just dedicated to information on those topics. It's chocked full of information from local experts and all kinds of guides to help folks use water efficiently outdoors and have a healthy, beautiful, thriving yard. Also, when you go to that website, if you scroll to the bottom, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. We promise not to share your information with anyone, and it has three or four articles every month from local experts about landscaping tips, a plant of the month, and all kinds of interesting things. For instance, the August one that'll be coming out next week has we've partnered with Edible Magazine on desert desserts. So all kinds of stuff covered in there. I encourage you to sign up. And don't forget, we're really here in the conservation program to help folks out. And any questions you might have about your yard, irrigation, rebates, anything related to that, we're happy to provide free consultations, phone calls, and emails. So we're here to help you have a beautiful and efficient yard, and please don't hesitate to reach out. Now, enough of that. Today, we're really excited to welcome Maria Thomas. She's a local plant expert who will be sharing just a really small part of her vast knowledge about considerations and for using and growing roses in our area. Now, I think this is a little bit counterintuitive, and many people are surprised to learn that indeed roses can be part of a balanced landscape that is both water efficient, relatively low maintenance, and supportive of pollinators and other wildlife. I think that in recent history, all of the ever blooming hybrid roses that are pumped up on water and fertilizers have led us to forget about what roses are and can be for much of history and throughout the world. And so I hope at the very least, today's presentation inspires many of you to visit the beautiful High Desert Rose Garden at the Albuquerque Biopark through the stunning photos that Maria will be sharing today. And I also hope that some of you will be encouraged to experiment with some of the rose species and cultivars highlighted today, and that those of you currently struggling with your roses will discover some practical techniques for greater success. And Maria brings decades of experience to working with plants in Albuquerque. And as I mentioned, she is currently the curator of plants at the Albuquerque Biopark. In this role, she oversees the horticultural staff, botanic exhibits, plant collections, and related programs across the biopark's 150-acre botanic garden, public park, and zoo. In addition to her work at the biopark, Maria is also an adjunct professor at the UNM's landscape architecture program, and many of you may also recognize her from her previous Water Authority webinars. She's also generously shared her expertise with our customers through those presentations and contributing to some of our educational resources that we have online and available to everyone on today's call. With that, Maria, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise. We're really excited to learn from you, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm Maria Thomas, and in my current role as the curator of plants at the Albuquerque Biopark, one thing that I have been tasked initially to design and build and now maintain is the High Desert Rose Garden. And yeah, like Amos said, I hope to dispel some of the myths about, roses, all roses being high maintenance, high fertilizer, high water, needy, fussy, kind of tyrants of the garden, when there are so many wonderful species and species hybrids that actually do quite well in arid environments. And through my presentation today, I'm excited to show you how we utilize these in our rose garden and maybe give you some ideas that you can take home. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started with the presentation. All right, well, I think we're here. So yeah, Rose Gardens Reimagined. And I guess why this came out is we wanted to initially develop a rose garden that did talk about how you could grow roses sustainably in the desert. Most people, when they think about roses, they think about modern production roses, which have been they're almost the Frankenstein of the rose world, where they've just been hybridized so much, and they've been pumped full of fertilizers to produce, high petal counts, large flowers that bloom successively throughout the growing season, whether it is 65 degrees or 100 degrees. They just kind of keep on going. And the way that they do that is through high water and high fertilizer use. These roses here in our High Desert Rose Garden is a very different story. And so that's kind of where I like to tell the story of how to grow roses in the desert, is by looking at our garden here at the High Desert Rose Garden. Having trouble. There we go. So the objectives of this presentation will to show how you compare roses with xeric companion plants that help with water efficiency and year-round interest. Many of these roses, they're once blooming species or species hybrid roses. So in the cooler parts of the season, in this late spring, very early summer, they'll kind of put on their big show and then they go into a summer dormancy. So what can you add to the garden when the roses aren't the main character in the story? And of course, once you start adding things in the garden, how do you keep this looking like a garden? So how to use plant layering techniques to create structure, function, and interest. And then through this, we'll look at different sustainable, climate-appropriate garden practices, including integrated pest management, what kind of fertilizers and mulches we use, and pruning techniques if necessary. And then finally, at the end, we'll identify some very hardy, drought-tolerant rose species and hybrids that we have found through our work at the Botanic Garden, that are most suitable for our climate here in New Mexico. So again, as Amos stated, there are a lot of slides. Right at the end, I have all my wonderful rose profiles. If I breeze through them rather quickly to stay on time, you all will have a copy of this slideshow at the end, so you can kind of review all the information on your own schedule. And my advance is acting really slow, so please be patient as I kind of move. I don't even know what's going on here. There we go. So here is our high desert rose garden at the Albuquerque Biopark Botanic Garden. And at first, let's have a little history so that you understand why this rose garden is different from most modern production rose gardens that you might see and think of when you're thinking about rose gardens. So these roses are all considered old garden or antique roses. For the most part, they all predate 1950. Many of them actually much older than that, early 1900s, 1800s, and even back into the 1700s. These are all own root hybrids and species roses. And why that is important is because they have not been grafted onto, like when they take one China rose, which is a very tender rose, and then they graft it or grow it onto a hardier rootstock. So a lot of you may have in the past come into a rose of some kind. So maybe it was a gift. You planted it in the ground. Winter came, the rose died back. When you planted it, it was pink, and then the spring it came back red. Well, that's because the hardy rootstock came back and it was a weak graft on top of that hardy root. So none of that happens in these roses. These roses have all been hybridized the old-fashioned way using pollen and nectar. So the first rose that I want to talk about is this damask rose. This is the autumn damask, and you can see it here in our high desert rose garden. She's a big, beautiful beauty. This is the only known repeat blooming rose in the old world before the introduction of the China rose. So before that, in the old world, you had your spring bloomers and then they get done and produce hips, and that was the show for the season. However, in China, there was a much more tender rose that actually was a perpetual or continual bloomer. And that's this one. So here on the left, that is Old Blush, also known as Parsons Pink. And that is the original China rose that was brought back from China and hybridized with roses in Europe to create a hardy or hybrid tea rose. So the ones that we have are Duché and Hermosa. You can see them at our botanic garden. And you can see these are actually very tidy, orderly roses. This is the average height for the rose, 4, maybe 5 feet. They do lend themselves to pruning quite easily, although you don't have to. They're usually pretty self-pruning, and once the buds are spent, they'll fall off. However, these are kind of the hardier versions of the China rose. Many of the China roses that were coming over were not hardy at all, which is why we started hybridizing them with these. So this is one of my favorite roses that we have in the garden, and it is the Fetida rose. The reason why I love it so much is because it is so tough and resilient, extremely drought tolerant. Again, only blooms in the spring, but then you get a nice show of rose hips as well. So that helps sustain the birds and other wildlife. And then once the leaves fall off, you have those beautiful rose hips kind of lingering into winter. So you have that interest as well. So here are 3 versions. On the left is the simple yellow flower original Fetida rose. And then we have a Persiana, which is a double hybrid. And that was hybridized about 1837 to get that double flower. And then one that you all may be familiar with is this Austrian copper rose on the right, which is that beautiful orange. So why these roses are important is because this yellow and orange coloration is where we get all of our oranges and peaches and reds and pinks. And this is La France. So she lives in our garden, and she is considered to be the first hybrid tea in production, where they took this Madame Falcott, which was a Fetida hybrid, and they hybridized that with a China rose to create La France, a very tough, resilient hybrid tea rose. So with that history, we'll just jump into a few basics. And right there, you can see Cynthia Brooke. There she is with her beautiful orange coloration that she got from that fetida grandparent. So when you see that on these own root hybrid tea roses, you know that they're really tough for our climate because they have that grandparent stock of that fetida rose. So now let's move into our basics. So we'll cover a little bit on irrigation, fertilization, pruning, and then pest and disease management. And once again, I hope that you get some new insight in the way that we do things here in this garden that makes it very different from some of these, high maintenance roses that we've come to kind of both love and abhor at the same time. So irrigation for us at the Botanic Garden, because it is a big garden, it's a half an acre, we do spray heads for the most part. And now I understand that this is a water conservation webinar, so we will focus on that part of it. And that's kind of where I want to kind of pop down a couple of line items there to that NP rotator. They provide a heavier stream with larger droplets, and that's that bottom photo. So you can kind of see the difference between those droplets. So the top one is kind of your typical turf spray head. It does okay when you have to irrigate large areas, but as we know in the desert, we have high winds, we have extreme heat, so there's a lot of evaporation that happens with that fine mist. So these NP rotators, well, first, they have a larger droplet and a heavier stream, so you're losing less to evaporation. And then it has a nice kind of rotating spray pattern, so you're able to distribute more evenly over a longer period, and you're getting less runoff as well, which for all those reasons, for us, this makes this the best choice that we use at the Botanic Garden. Now, for you as a homeowner, you might look at something a little closer to this with the shrub and tree bubblers. And that bottom right photo is kind of a nice high output shrub bubbler. So when we're talking about some of the techniques we use later, this kind of can come in handy because it does create a wider flow pattern and spread the moisture more evenly within your bed. However, these can also be a little more difficult to install and maintain because they're buried pretty deep with that hard PVC. So we'll just kind of zip down to this next one. And sorry about that little bar up there. I don't even know if you all see that, but it's up there for me. So micro irrigation. So this is what we recommend for homeowners because you usually have smaller landscape systems that make these easy enough to maintain. For us at the Botanic Garden, when we get 500 volunteers with rakes and shovels, this type of system can be destroyed pretty quickly, which then creates lots of issues with leakage and runoff and everything else that we really want to try to avoid. So this bottom photo is this kind of inline drip, and that's kind of what I would recommend for you all if you're trying to do some of the techniques here, because it is a drip system. It does conserve water in a very effective, efficient way, but at the same time, it is also very useful to spread the water throughout a bed in some of the ways that you're going to see we want to do to create some of these other successful techniques. So one of the last things I want to point out for the irrigation is that we use passive water harvesting techniques. So this is very much like a waffle garden type design. And so you can see in that big photo kind of in the middle, there is some low depressions. Like you can see where the surface area is with the hardscape, the sidewalk, and the crusher fines. And then the beds actually drop down a few inches from there. And you can see that with like all of this ground cover and those nice little kind of shallow dips that you see. So what that does is when we get a high rain event, like a big monsoon storm, all the water comes from that sidewalk, from that crusher fine, and just pools down into those beds. So we're collecting additional water for these plants in the heat of the day. And you're starting to see some of the other things that we're working into the equation to help control evaporation as well. But before we talk about that, we'll take a look at our xeric berm. And this is the berm that's around that big, beautiful atrium with all the windows in the rose garden. So what we've done here, you can see in that far right photo, are the canales from the building, and they drop down. So all the water running off of that building drops down into these constructed stream beds, and they kind of twist and wind down the hill slope through the landscape. And so everywhere where we put a twist in that stream bed, it slows the water, and the water then is absorbed into the landscape to help with this very dry xeric planting. So, we have things like the opuntia, the prickly pear, some very drought tolerant salvias, some artemisias, even that big tree there is a nice Russian hawthorn. So these are all very drought tolerant selections that we've used as companion plants to help tell the story of, for example, that beautiful yellow fetida rose that loves just these types of conditions. And then finally, we use this ground cover as a living mulch, and we use these companion plants as well. What this does is it helps reduce evaporation from the moisture because of that cooling effect that those green plants, they cover the ground and they cool it off and they reduce evaporation. It also helps shade the root zones of these roses. So roses that might like it a little cooler are getting a wonderful little microclimate underneath that carpet of that blue creeping phlox that you see in the photo ahead of you. The other thing that it does is that all of the leaf and litter that occurs in those nice kind of living ground covers, they break down seasonally. So we're very gently creating a feed cycle for these roses. So they're getting nutrients that they need through the natural cycle, the annual cycle of these ground covers, providing all of this shade, moisture reduction, evaporation reduction, and then just this really nice ecology as well. And I'll get into that too in a minute here. One thing I'd like to point out is that we do allow them to naturalize. So that creates that carpeted look, which means no weed barrier. There are very few things in this world that weed barrier are good for. Certainly not gardening for so many reasons, but that's a whole nother talk. And the other thing that I do that I think really helps with this design is that I choose complementary colors in the same color family. When we're working with these roses that are all these different colors, you see the pink and the peach and the orange, finding a palette of plants that can complement each of those colors that you're using without competing. And what that does is it kind of creates this unified look throughout the whole garden. So even if you have a bed of orange, a bed of pink, a bed of hot pink, reds right behind that, it all transitions really well through this nice ground cover. And again, this is a creeping phlox, and it blooms late April, early May, and it consistently blooms through June. But then once the heat comes on, it stops blooming, but it has a nice evergreen cover. So not only does that help, again, reduce the amount of heat stress on the root zones of the roses, but in the winter as well, it helps kind of keep those roots a little bit warmer so they're less stressed by our cold winds. Here's another example where we've used ground cover as living mulch and companion plants with them. So this sea lavender, for example, is extremely drought tolerant. What I love about it is when it puts out those flowers on the left, it creates this kind of little airy cloud. We've done that with Gaura in some of the other areas as well. And what that does is that is just like a very non-aggressive companion plant that really creates a nice shadow on that ground and cools the ground quite well. In the middle, you can see the Phlox subulata again, the creeping phlox with the bearded iris. I love adding these irises in because before the roses are really doing anything, the irises are up and they're blooming, they're providing support for pollinators. And then because they're a summer dormant bulb, once the heat comes on, they go dormant and they're using less moisture and nutrients to get through the heat heat of the summer as well. So I would recommend any sort of xeric summer like dormant bulbs as a great addition to rose gardens as well. And then here we have a little bit of a creeping or wall germander. And once again, you can see it creates that nice tight low mat like along that wall or in the ground. It is also evergreen, so you get the advantage of like the winter protection as well as the summer protection. And once again, just ongoing with blooms throughout the growing season. So it's a great pollinator plant too. And then here's an example where I have three plants that are kind of in that yellow greenish family. So like lady's mantle, those hairy leaves, that's why it is so resilient and drought tolerant, and it's just a great choice for a ground cover here in New Mexico. Everybody loves and knows chocolate flower. Why wouldn't you want a little vanilla in with your rose scent? I think that's a great combo too. And again, see how it grows light and airy. So it creates enough circulation and airflow for the plants around it, but it also is just enough to kind of shade and cool the ground as well. And then here's another really beautiful one that I love, this the silver blade primrose. So that long, narrow, silvery leaf, very similar to an evening primrose, but this one requires quite a bit less water because of those wonderful indicators on that silver hairy leaf. And then that reduced surface area of the leaf as well really helps it get by with less water. Here's a little bit of an array in kind of the blues and purples and silvers. Spanish lavender, believe it or not, we're having some success keeping this alive in our newly designated Zone 8 climate. So it's a little different. And so I like to include it in the talk. I love it with that English thyme there. We'll get into the use of the thymes and the fragrant herbs here in a second as well. Of course, we all know Landseer is just incredibly drought tolerant. Monarda fistulosa is our native bee balm. I do love that because then it creates that wonderful seed head in the fall and the winter that supports birds as well. And then this is one that I kind of have started kind of messing around with, experimenting, is this purple prairie clover. So again, extremely drought tolerant. What I really like about this one as well is it does fix nitrogen, much like many other plants in that clover family. So as far as providing additional nitrogen to feed your roses, adding something like this into the mix is probably an excellent choice. And then let's not forget about our architecture and structure. We'll start off talking about trees, companion shrubs, and desert accents. So one thing that I did is I wanted to continue telling the story of the rose. So all of what you see here, actually plants that are also in the rose family, like the hawthorn, the physocarpus or the ninebark, which is that beautiful cascading white flowers there. And for me, these trees and shrubs have done extremely well in our rose garden. They have a lot of weight, so they feel substantial. They can really anchor the landscape. But again, they're just so resilient to our heat and our drought that they're an excellent choice if you're looking for something to be a companion alongside a rose. And here's a few more. So once again, playing with the rose family. So we have Western sand cherry, which you all may know is in many xeriscape guides is an excellent choice. Also in the rose family, early spring blooming, and then you get the wonderful fruit for the birds later in the season. Nanking cherry, this Prunus tomentosa in the middle, incredibly delicious edible cherries. We grow this on our berm underneath our cottonwood trees. It does quite well in the shade. And we do have extreme dry spells from time to time, not only because of the heat and the drought that we are all dealing with, but where we can have prolonged breaks with our irrigation as we experience this spring. And this tree, this Nanking cherry, now that it's established, it didn't even seem phased by it. And then last here on the right is this double flowering almond. So this is a triloba. Many may be familiar with kind of the short shrubby flowering almond. This one is actually will produce a small tree over time. And so this is another one that has done really well for us in the garden in heat and drought and full exposures. And finally, these wonderful desert accents on our xeric berm. Cliff rose, a Persia, it is also in the rose family. Then this wonderful Mexican blue sage. You can see how nice that covers the ground and just shades everything around it. This banana yucca, great structural architecture, especially when the winter, when all the roses are pretty dormant and woody. You have just this beautiful thing standing out in the landscape. And the same with the fringe sage and this Elisana thornless or spineless Opuntia prickly pear. Just they add great architecture to the landscape. So when the roses aren't telling a story, these guys are taking over. And that brings us to the next category of fertilizer and soil amendment. So in addition to using the green mulches that kind of create and break down their own fertilizer for the plants around them, we tend to believe less is more. So the first thing we do, which I will tell everybody in every talk that I ever give, leave the leaves. I know this is counterintuitive to what many people think of with roses, how you have to manage disease by cutting and cleaning and getting all of that debris out right away. Not so for us. So we leave them through early spring. And what that does is, again, it breaks down and it helps create the nutrients that we need without having to add in a bunch of heavy chemical fertilizers for these roses. So we also use this wonderful Soilutions forest floor mulch. What I like about it is it has 10% compost, so it's a very slow release. That's another thing that you can come into problems with if you're pumping your roses full of fertilizer, especially in the hottest parts of summer. They're really not using that nutrition. It's too hot. So what happens is it just keeps ending up getting dumped as salts into the soil and into the groundwater. So be gentle with the soil and the water around you. We have so very little of it. So just go easy with the just organic compost. This Yum Yum mix we use very well. And you can see the NPK on it is 211. It is such a low level nutrient. I mean, it's pretty much, I think, juniper berries and alfalfa. One of the things that we use that's probably the heaviest is this Max C, but we only typically use it as a foliar feeding very early in the season, and we dilute it significantly. So the NPK ratio is reduced quite a bit by foliar feeding this Max C. But these products like the Happy Frog and the Back to Earth, Down to Earth Rose and Flower Mix, once again, the NPKs are so low on this. And I just have to emphasize that less is more when it comes to fertilizing in the desert. And then finally, integrated pest management. So these are some wonderful shots that I've taken in our rose garden of different little pollinators and beneficial insects. And okay, maybe a cucumber beetle isn't necessarily a beneficial, but it is a passive pollinator. So, and it's very adorable in that shot silk hybrid tea. So, you know, we try to support all creatures great and small. Fig beetles here on this wonderful yellow hybrid tea Eclipse. Beetles were actually some of the first prehistoric pollinators. So shout out to them for lasting this long. Let's try to keep supporting that cycle by not using a bunch of pesticides to control things on our roses. I think one of the things I've always heard the most about is if you destroy the insects, there's no reason for beneficials to be there. So just acceptable level and is where we're going with this. But first, let's talk a little bit about some of the rose viruses and fungus that you might see. So when we see something like this is rose rosette on one side and then the mosaic virus on the right. There's not a whole lot that you can do. So we will just, this is the one instance where we will just remove the rose completely. There's no use managing it. And it can spread to not only your other roses, but all those wonderful plants I showed you in the rose family. So I would say that anytime you're making any cuts in your garden, sterilize your pruning tools. The best thing is rubbing alcohol. Just take a rag and some rubbing alcohol and rub it on the blades between each cut, between each plant. because these things can be transmitted from rose to rose, from roses to apples, for example. So we do take this pretty seriously, and they're pretty distinct when you look at them. You get that rose rosette is that horrible curling leaf, and then the mosaic virus, you can see that kind of veining coming along the center line of the rose as well as the ribs coming out. Similar is this Black City mold. You can see that it's got that discoloration as well with that yellowing, but it's quite a different pattern, and I'll show you that in a second, and powdery mildew. So these are both fungus, and in Albuquerque area, we don't typically have a lot of trouble with these. We usually don't have to do too much with these. We typically get them later in September when the nights are cooling off and we're getting summer rains, but then we don't do a lot of management because it's just a seasonal thing, and it never seems to get worse or spread. And it's just for that small window in the late fall that we typically see this. But if you do see that you're having a persistent problem with this, I would first recommend you improve airflow around your plants. So by maybe opening up with some very careful pruning, and I'll show you that in a minute, or use like an organic fungicide. You don't have to go napalm with this stuff, because it is just less is more in this instance too. Something like copper sulfate, lime sulfur, neem, or even garlic, like a garlic oil will work wonders with fungus. After the treatment, you're still going to see the discoloration, but the fungus will be gone. So it'll just affect this year's growth. Once you get it under control, you shouldn't see that discoloration any longer. And then I promised to kind of compare fungus versus virus. When you see them side by side, they're very distinct patterns. So you can very easily tell the difference between the rose mosaic virus and just Black City mold. Further along the integrated pest management, always use the least toxic method first. The less chemicals we are dumping in our soil and our water, the better off for us in the desert. And do things like natural deterrents and natural predators when possible. So again, we don't go napalm on the roses, which is why we have this wonderful, beautiful orb weaver doing its job, taking up all those insects. Right here on the left, you see this wonderful oleum photo. It's just a garlic. And this came from a wonderful PBS special on the Queen's Rose Garden, where they actually grow acres of garlic and create their own garlic spray to treat their roses. So if the Queen of England is doing it, we can do it here in the desert. Worst case scenario, hard water works great for aphids, insect killing soap if very necessary with things like mealybugs. But honestly, just you need to have the insect base in there if you do want to start attracting beneficial insects like these lacewings, lady beetles, even these aphid parasites. Arbico Organics is a great place to buy these things online if you want to do that, or you could just be really patient. If you build it and you do not spray it, they will come. I did put the lady beetle in the middle because people always, this bottom image in the lady beetle, that kind of alien creature, people are always asking us, what is this? Is it killing my rose? It's like, no, you really want that there. That is the infant phase, the nymph phase of the ladybugs. And so, just know what your insect is, and if it's even necessary to treat before you decide to stepping up the pest management. One thing I do is I include all these fragrant herbs, and I feel very strongly that they help with deterrence, not only for insects, but also things like porcupines, for example. Our hybrid teas, the modern production roses in the front of the Botanic Garden, we have a porcupine family that lives up there, and they treat those like the salad buffet. My roses back closer to the bosque, surrounded by cottonwood trees, and therefore more porcupine, I really don't see the same level of damage. And I do strongly believe that it is because I include these fragrant herbs as deterrents, and it kind of confuses them. They don't get that scent of the rose right off. They have to go through all these other things before they can find that buffet. So they find the buffet somewhere else up in the front with those modern hybrid productions that are just so much more delicate and delicious, apparently. So here's some of my favorites. And here's a few more. And again, all of these are extremely low water, drought tolerant selections as companion plants for these rose gardens. These Millennium Oleums, I think they're just outstanding. So once the phlox stops blooming, those purple millenniums pop up everywhere and it continues that nice subtle understory. You can see they're only about 18 to 24 inches tall. So while we have a lot of plant diversity happening in those beds, it has that nice stacked layering effect so that it never feels overwhelming. And then now on to spring pruning. You can kind of see that ground cover in action. And that is why we love it so much, because those roses, this is probably March in that photo. Not a lot going on with the roses, but when you come through that archway into the rose garden, you see all this phlox blooming across the garden, you know something exciting is about to happen. And so I would recommend with spring pruning, it all is dependent on the rose. There is no one formula that says I have to start with rose number 1 and end with rose number 99 and do the exact same thing to each rose every step of the way. You really have to pay attention to the individual rose and what its needs are. For us, spring pruning can take place anytime from February to March. It really is weather dependent. It really is dependent on the location of the rose, what the exposure to the wind is. So when we start seeing them beginning to break bud is the ideal point where we start saying, okay, if we're going to do the pruning, the time is to do it at this point for these hybrid teas. We'll get into that a little more. So hybrid teas, repeat blooming shrub roses, hybrid teas, hybrid perpetuals, some of the bourbons, definitely the Chinas. They have a pretty typical formula. This bottom diagram shows you how to make a proper pruning cut. That's not just for roses, it's for everything in the world. If you need to prune it, that is the recommended way. And then you can see on the hybrid teas where it's like you're reducing about 1/3 to 2/3 of the canopy. So why I say 1/3 to 2/3, again, it really recommends on the rose. And what we've seen is if you prune too much, then it really stresses the rose out and they have a hard time coming back. So they're expending a lot of resources, which includes fertilizer and water, to try to get that growth back, because every plant has their optimum growth size and every plant will strive to be that optimum growth size. So if you find that sweet spot where you're pruning just enough off to keep the roses down so that you can bend over and smell them and they're just wonderful, you found that size. If you're just knocking it down below knee level because somebody told you to take 2/3 off every spring, you're stressing that plant out and it's going to need more nutrients to recover. So this is how we baby our roses in a very delicate, low maintenance sort of way. So replete blooming climbers like bourbons, muscets, large flowering climbers, climbing teas, they really like having those older woody canes removed. So that's the key to these. Once they start getting really kind of super woody, that's the key to like take this cane out and let that new growth, you're regenerating the rose. That's what you're doing with these. You're not cutting a total top off the sides. You're removing the oldest material from the base. And then once blooming roses, species roses, hybrids, ramblers, make sure when you plant them, you're putting them where they have room to grow, because these roses do not like to be pruned. They're not designed to be pruned. These hybrid teas, those were hybridized so much with those Chinas that they're just like, yeah, cut me, I need a haircut. Everything's great. We're going to bounce right back. These once blooming shrub roses, not so much. So once again, the only time you might remove them is if you're rejuvenating the rose by taking out the oldest canes or opening it up to create a little more airflow and circulation. So with all of that, we've made it to the actual part of the slideshow, Roses of the High Desert. And I've got about 10 minutes to go over 30 rose slices or more. So we're going to go kind of fast. But once again, you will get a copy of this to look over on your own time. So species and their hybrids, once again, these are the most toughest roses that we grow. This Fetida Agnes is a Rugosa Fetida hybrid. In my experience, Rugosas have been a little bit fussier. Those are those beautiful kind of pink flowering Japanese roses. They have a really rough leaf. They have a blue-green leaf. So all those things might make me think that they're pretty tough. However, from the part of the world that they're from, they do like a little more acid, so they do need a little more fertilizer until you step in and hybridize it with this beautiful Fetida rose. Then you got the best of both worlds, essentially. And then here's the Persian double rose. This one was brought west by early settlers. So they find this rose all over the Oregon Trail, which is kind of cool. Then this is the von Scharnhorst. So this is another Fetida hybrid, just this beautiful, beautiful double flowering white rose. This is in one of the hottest spots in our garden, and it does quite well. But once again, these are big roses. Not to say that they don't make smaller versions of the hybrids. You can absolutely find them with a little research, and I will give you a resource list at the end. But these roses, make sure you give them a little room so that you're not struggling to keep this rose happy. Here, this Harrison's yellow, this is one of the ones that they find on the Oregon Trail, and this is actually what they say is the yellow rose of Texas. So the homesteaders brought it west, ended up planted all over Texas, and this is the famed song, The Yellow Rose of Texas, Unless You Believe My Father, and then it's his sister, my Aunt Deborah. However, here on the right, we have the Xanthissima hugonis. So this rose was brought from China to Kew Gardens in 1899. And that is when this rose became one of the species hybrids used in these hybrid teas. I grow this rose in my home, and it is beautiful. You see that nice fine ferny foliage there. It is just so wonderful, so drought tolerant. If it can grow on the West Mesa in my sandy yard, it can grow in your yard for sure. And then these are a couple of other spectacular roses are these Spinosuma hybrids. These are just beautiful. They just like to be big and sprawl, and the bees love them, and they just have this wonderful fragrance. And this one on the left is Furling's Gold. We have tried to figure out what this is. We call it a spicy, musky, vanilla-y, nutmeggy, clovey, butterscotch Christmas rose. That's what it smells like. It smells like pumpkin pie to some people, and it is just outstanding. And it's a medium-sized Spinosuma or Pypnifolia hybrid. And then this one, this beautiful pink one, Furling's Morgan on the right, is much similar to its little sisters here, where they're just big and gorgeous and sprawling. And then the damask roses. These roses are the roses that were made, used in perfumery. Very tough roses. These can actually be a little shade tolerant, as you can see that Isfahan in the center. I mean, what a romantic spot that is. If you're looking for a place to propose to somebody, it could be there. It is in the High Desert Rose Garden. And then that autumn damask, which we talked about a little bit, is a repeat bloomer. And then if you like the white damasks, there you have Madame Hardy, and she is a little more well-behaved, a little sizable. So if you have a smaller garden, that might be a good choice too. And then the Noisette roses. So this crepuscule, I hope I said that correctly. Sorry, French speakers. This one is outstanding. So we decided to incorporate these noisettes into our tea beds because we loved that romance of the height and the sprawling rose coming out of that orderly tea bed. Not all of them are that big. Once again, this little Joan of Arc here on the right is a much more well-behaved 3 to 4 foot rose. So if you want a small noisette, that would be a good one to look at. And then this is Madame Alfred Carrier. This is the one that graces our arbors as you walk into the rose garden, and it is outstanding. Very low maintenance. Once again, we remove the old woody canes and we just try to train it. The thing with training climbers is you really want to keep them more horizontal as you circle around a post or over an arbor, because if you train it straight up, you're just going to end up with all the roses at the tippy top and nothing along the side. So the more horizontal you can keep a rose as you train it around a structure, the more flowers you're going to end up with in the long run. And then the Romance of the Bourbon Roses. So these were probably hybridized between China's and damask roses. They're some of the oldest garden roses that we know that are hybrid roses. They have that damask fragrance and they have the full petals of both the damask and the Chinas. This Variegata de Bologna is one of my volunteers' personal favorites because of that crazy petal you see on it. Although I tend to like the bourbons like the Souvenir de la Malmaison, which is a climber and a shrub rose as well. So you can get a smaller shrub rose in that version as well. And I mean, just look at it. That's why people love bourbons, is that beautiful petal count. Zéphrine Drouin is a bulletproof rose there on the right. It goes up the columns of our atrium and it does quite well with very little maintenance needs. And then these are our climbers. We're getting into the hybrid teas and hybrid perpetuals. So this Devonensis is on one of our shade arbors, and you can see what an amazing climber that is. Beautiful petals. And I do want to say at this point that every rose that I'm showing you is just wonderfully fragrant, because it was my philosophy that if a rose doesn't have a fragrance, it doesn't belong in a rose garden. So everything you see here has also been selected because of the beautiful fragrance that it carries. And then this New Dawn, so something a little lighter and brighter here. And then this is something, this Ash Wednesday, it's that chocolate rose. So it has that kind of that lavender, just pale lilac-y chocolate color that's very unusual in a rose. And you can see where I've paired it with these beautiful yellow bearded irises. So you just have them playing off one another. Just a great combination, I think. And then this OD Pink is a found rose. So this is a really great story. There were a lot of people that would go around to the old homesteads, old cemeteries, and they would find these roses that had just been living without care, without supplemental water, and just thriving in these conditions. And so this is one of them. They think that they know that it was Irene Watts, a hybrid tea, but they're not really sure. They're just judging it by the size, the shape, the structure, the petal count, and the smell. So they have an idea that this could be that, but because they can't definitively say that, yes, it is Irene Watts, they named it OD Pink. And once again, if you're finding this on a grave site or a old homestead where the entire building is fallen down and the rose is growing over, this is probably a pretty tough rose. And then this beautiful Miss Lavelle Swisher, and she's just so delicate looking, but again, a very tough hybrid tea that we've selected because it can do so well here. And it just carries that soft elegance that we think of when we think of roses. And then there's Shot Silk. So more of a typical kind of hot pink. Again, that's about what, 4-foot rose, so pretty well behaved. And then Violinista Costa. So this one came from Spain, hybridized, and you can see it with that Snow and Summer in the bottom there. So Snow and Summer is also another very wonderful ground cover that we use. And then you can see how well behaved that rose is. It's only about the height of a bearded iris. So if you have a small garden, this might be a good one for you. And then on the other end of the spectrum is Madame Edouard Herat. And again, if I'm murdering the French, please forgive me. It is not a language that I'm used to, but I've grown a little more familiar by learning all of these rose names. So a little taller, a little bigger, has that beautiful orange hue in the center. We get that from that tough Fetida rootstock. And then speaking of Fetidas, we're getting into the yellows, golds, and oranges. So Eclipse is just an outstanding. This photo in the middle was taken about a week ago when we're having constant 100-degree heat, and it still feels like blooming, which is great because we know it's tough. And then there's Magritte Sunset, that middle photo also a week ago. So you can see it's not taking the heat as well, but still does quite well as far as what kind of hybrid teas we can grow in the desert. Miss Erin Ward, another very well-behaved, more petite stock size rose, and Sol d'Or. So this one, check this out, 1885. So this was bred in France in 1885. And then along, not to be outdone, here in the US, Sutter's Gold, 1946. And to me, that is a very closely similar rose. So I feel like somebody said, I'm going to take this small rose and breed it with a bigger rose, and I'm going to get a bigger, more expressive rose in this Sutter's Gold. And look at that glow on those petals. And then speaking of glow, this is Irish fire flame. So this is from the same plant. So this rose will demonstrate all of these beautiful colors at the same time. And, you know, one will open orange and then fade to this pink. And so it's just a beautiful array of color. And this is a pretty big rose. And then we get into reds. We probably couldn't have a rose talk if we didn't include the reds. For me, they're not as exciting as some of the others, but here they are. Crimson Glory is a very small, well-behaved red rose. If you're just looking for something, you just want that nice color accent in your yard. Chrysler Imperial, this is kind of where we cheated on that 1950 designation. So Chrysler Imperial is 52 because I did want to include some red roses in this garden, and there's just not as many reds as all of the other ones that I showed you. And then California Centennial, which I think is just an outstanding rose. You can see there in front of the fountain, just a prolific bloomer. Again, a little bit smaller in stature than the Chrysler Imperial. So depending on the garden size that you're looking at, this might be a good red selection for you. And with that, we made it to the end. I don't think I went over that much. And here are my resources. I will just run through them really quick. Antique Rose Emporium and High Country Roses have just been an outstanding amount of knowledge and resources. They come in really beautiful sizes. Antique Rose Emporium, you can get 2-gallon roses from the start. High Country Roses are usually about quart size. So if you have a little time to grow them. And then Rogue Valley Roses is also a very good source, although they tend to come in smaller sizes. So you kind of do need a little time to get those things going. Heirloom Roses, also very good. Lens Roses is a really great place for your research as well as help me find. And then there at the bottom, Arbocore Organics, because I do strongly believe that including the beneficial insects into our garden is all of the pest management that we need. And with that, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope I kept us on track. And if you have any questions, you can always reach me at my city email, mjthomas@cabq.gov. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. That was a fantastic presentation. I worked at the Botanic Garden alongside Maria, and I learned a ton today. I left feeling inspired to want to try out a few of these. I also really appreciate your description of some of the scents of the roses, or the fragrance, I guess is the proper word. And for those of you who have not ever smelled an old world spicy quote unquote rose, it's life-changing, and I encourage you to go to the Botanic Garden when some of those are in bloom and experience that. It touches your soul. It's really it's hard to understate the kind of how deep that touches your genetic level. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Here on the slide, we just have some of our contact information. We will be following up with a couple of things. You'll receive an email that has a link to the recording of the presentation, and then we will send a follow-up that has Maria's a PDF of her presentation and some of the resources that we've mentioned today. So thank you so much for joining. Again, we have all the information we have for you that qualify for the rebate, and you should expect that within about 90 days. And we have a whole series of other webinars coming up about every other Friday with some great topics through the end of October. So please join us for those. Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks again, Maria. Take care.
Thank you.